right, hello. I'll get myself a glass of water. And get the microphone on. Not really sure if this makes much difference to the sound quality, but you know, I always trying to improve for you. Hello, welcome to, this is week 6. Well, you're about to enter week 6 of Atheism for Lent, so I'll wait for a few minutes just for people to arrive. It's another beautiful day here. The last week has been stunning. I can't wait for, like, in 3 weeks' time or 4 weeks' time, a pile of people are joining me here for Wake, which I'm very excited about. I think we've got the best lineup we've ever had. So between Wake and Spark this year, very excited. So people are going to be descending soon. Just getting that stuff sorted out. What else has been going on? Oh, we have 3 cartels meeting. Those cartels are 3 groups that are creating Church of the Contradiction liturgies. And once those 3 groups have created some and critiqued them, we're going to present them to everybody else, first of all on Patreon, then beyond. So that's been going on. And I am back to writing. I've been kind of off and on a book for a while. The difficulty is, it's not that, I just find there's better ways to communicate. I really like this, because if I'm thinking about something, I can get on a camera and I can talk immediately to people, whereas a book takes a year to write and another year before it gets out. So I don't know, but I do have a book that I'm working on. But anyway, there you go. You're caught up with me. I wish I could ask you how you're doing, but I can't. But do say hi in the comments section. Oh, hello, there's Ulrich, who's going to be at Wake, and Roger, who's going to be at Wake. We've got a few Wakers, brilliant. If you're watching live, always remember you can ask questions in the chat box, stick a Q, and then I can look for the Q and hopefully address your questions. Right. Okay, hello, welcome to week 6. By the way, if you have got this far, if you get to the end of Atheism for Lent, you will know more about atheism than 99% of people out there. You will be in the 1% in terms of understanding it, but also hopefully kind of working through the different iterations of it. Now, Atheism for Lent is 7 weeks. The first and the last week are half weeks. The first half week is just really solidifying the word God as the supreme being. So God is a signifier for ultimate reality, right? So the first few days are about this God, this ultimate reality exists in some way. The very last week, week 7, is a half week, and that's my work, Theology. It's a way to kind of hopefully contextualize what I do in relation to this journey that you've been on for 40 days. And then the 5 weeks that are sandwiched between God as supreme being and Theology, the filling of the sandwich is 5 iterations of atheism, 5 fields of atheism. And within each of those fields, there is a huge richness. And in each of these weeks, I introduce you to about 6 of those kind of like ways in which that type of atheism manifests itself. So what I'm going to do is, same as what I do most weeks, I'm actually going to keep going on the journey, go back and just outline where we've got to today, then introduce the readings for this week. So week 2, which is the first proper week, the first filling of the sandwich, right? That week is the first form of atheism. And I call that classical atheism. It's also, new atheism fits in there. It is the atheism that is what most people think when they think about the term. It's the non-belief in God or the gods and the supernatural and things beyond the material realm, right? So that's the standard atheism, if you go onto ChatGPT or onto Google or whatever, that is the atheism you'll see. If you go onto YouTube, that's the atheism that 99% of popular videos are about, right? And that form of atheism is a simple negation of God. So you say God exists, this classical atheism that I call it, new atheism, you could call it, yeah, always trying to find an appropriate term. The problem with all of these terms is you're trying to find something that kind of, like a set, right? You name the set. And that's often difficult, very difficult last week with the existential theologians, because existentialists famously don't like to be called existentialists. So, nobody likes a label. And the truth is, people are so complicated, especially great thinkers are so rich that they don't even fit within, they don't even agree with themselves. So it's very hard to fit them into a bucket when each of them is so rich. But of course, there are ways for learning, you have to get a grip. You have to find some way to get a foothold. That's what I'm doing with you guys. And I'm trying to give you a foothold by describing 5 forms of atheism. The first being, as I said, classical atheism, where God does not exist. Now, it could either be agnosticism, well, we don't really know if God exists, but all of the iterations of God that are put forward have problems of various kinds. It can be what's called regional atheism, where it's going like, I'm not atheist against every God, but against these ones, I'm an atheist, right? That atheism is always a rejection of atheism. So from that angle, you can't really be a universal atheist, because somebody can always think of a new theism that you have to then reject. But then we also looked at, some people will say, well, we can be an atheist because we can say that the concept of God is logically impossible. If the concept of God is logically impossible, then according to some people, we can reject God out of hand, all possible notions of God. So we looked at that. We looked at the various arguments, classical atheism, that's the easiest. So we move on then to the second field of atheism. And that's the apophatic tradition, or the mystical tradition. They mean basically the same thing. The apophatic tradition is atheist because what it says is the signifier God, and I want to, this is very difficult when you're watching me talk like this to do what I'm about to ask you to do, but almost imagine you're going through a veil of ignorance, and on every step of the way kind of forget about everything you know and come to this afresh. So this form of atheism says the word God, this signifier God, this 3-letter word that we use, is a signifier for a hyper-reality that cannot be signified. Okay, so God is the word we give to a supreme reality that cannot be conceptualized or experienced. And in the apophatic tradition, there's really 2 important points they're trying to make. One is they're trying to say that that idea is logically possible, right? So you might look at someone like Jean-Luc Marion, who is a philosopher who doesn't want to say that this is true, that God exists as a hyper-reality, but what he attempts to show is that this idea is logically plausible. Also, Immanuel Kant gave an argument like that. Spinoza kind of gave an argument a little bit like that. So they're the great philosophers who go, it is possible that there is a hyper-reality that cannot be filtered through our minds, right? So there's a sense in which, and Kant is the one who famously does this most systematically, he kind of says, there's for anything to be experienced or known, it has to filter through a set of categories, a set of conditions. And if something can't filter through those conditions, we can't experience it or know it. Right? And, Kant is saying, so what he calls the noumenal, what we can call God here, the noumenal or God, is the name of a reality that we cannot filter, that we cannot grasp. So that's number one. The apophatic want to say that's a logically consistent idea. And then 2, they want to say that if this hyper reality encounters us, then it won't be encountered as an experience or something we can conceptualize, but it will be experienced, or it'll be felt as a counter experience and a type of non-thought. We will be overwhelmed, we will be short-circuited. There's a type of evental experience, a traumatic event, right, that overwhelms us. So it is a type of experience, but it's an experience of something beyond experience, and it's a knowledge of something beyond knowledge. And oh yes, the word for this, I haven't used this word yet, but I'll introduce it this week, because every week I try and take a slightly different angle to kind of make this clearer. And at first you might be trying to get every point across, but the main desire is that you just start to feel each field and understand each field. So in the apophatic tradition, the word sublime is important, because in the philosophical tradition of Kant, the word sublime means an overwhelming encounter with something that you cannot grasp. And for Kant, there was two, and we actually looked at this in week 2, where Kant says there's basically an intellectual overwhelming and there's a bodily overwhelming, and the sublime is when you feel overwhelmed bodily and mentally. And this is also a very popular form of atheism that we see today, especially on places like the West Coast, but also with the rise of psychedelics and the rise of 5-MeO DMT, where people will say that on 5-MeO, for example, there is a experience of being utterly overwhelmed so that your ego dissipates entirely. And it's a type of, they will say themselves, it's not so much an experience because there's no me to experience. It feels like I'm gone, I'm not there. It's something so wild that I feel like I'm exploding, right? And that's kind of what the mystics are saying. And that is atheism, because the word God does not name something. It is the word we use to name what cannot be named and what names us. Now, in classical atheism, religion is generally explained as maybe like, oh, it arises out of ignorance, it arises out of hope and longing, desires. It is a functional, it helps build community and tell you friend from enemy, or it's a holdover from more primitive forms of human society, right? So that's what religion is in classical atheism. So classical atheism, God doesn't exist, or we can't know God exists. It's a logically weird concept we cannot know, right? That's God. And religion is the product of hope, of ignorance, of maybe creating social solidarity, or an error, an evolutionary blip, right? Whatever. With the mystics, the apophatic tradition, God names what cannot be named, and religion is an attempt to live in the aftermath of an encounter with that beyond, that hyper being. So religion becomes what's called theopoetics. It's a type of hymn of praise. Religion doesn't describe God. Religion is more how people, at its best, because the apophatic will say, of course there's religion that just is born from ignorance and hope, and of course there's religion that's just functional, maybe creates solidarity and is, cultural, all of that, of course. But there is also a religious impetus that comes from the aftermath of a tsunami. And that kind of religion is a religion that seeks to praise what we cannot know, remain faithful to that event, to keep reminding ourselves of it, and potentially to invite it to again transform us and change us. Because in that tsunami of this otherwise than being, we become something different. You're no longer lost in purchasing products and everyday societal stuff like developing status and all of that, because none of that makes sense. None of that's worth anything in the aftermath of this encounter. And if you remember Pascal's Night of Fire, his testimony that he wrote and sewed into the inner lining of his jacket, which was this sense of like, this is overwhelming. And then for Pascal, the response was to say that, or not to say, to feel that worldly status and worldly possessions just didn't do it for him. So it creates a post-capitalist subject, you know, within the apophatic tradition, because you're no longer caught up in, as I say, status and wealth and accumulation, because none of it really, you know, means the same, okay? So that's week 2, right? So I'm taking my time here because, you know, want to really chart out this journey. Week 1, classical atheism. God does not exist, a pure negation. Religion, born of hope, ignorance, social solidarity, maybe evolutionary kind of reasons. Apophatic tradition. The signifier God is a signifier that signifies what cannot be signified because it's something so great, so beyond. And religion is the aftermath of an encounter with this, which is the sublime encounter, an encounter that overwhelms us. I talked about trauma in previous weeks to kind of help put this together. Religion is the alphabeticizing of that. It's a theopoetics. That's week 2. Then week 3, the third field of atheism, is a group who, broadly speaking, would say that, okay, that experience, maybe, who knows, maybe some people have it occasionally up on the mountaintop, whatever, but what we as humans do is we invent things, we create things. We invent technologies and tools, but also our words invent things. And everything we create and the way we look at the world says something about us. So here, God, the signifier God, becomes a way of understanding the world. Either ourselves as individuals with Feuerbach, well, no, ourselves as community with Feuerbach, or the ideology of the age with Marx, or the hopes and the dreams of a human being and what we want, or with Sartre, a way of covering over, you know, the terror of our freedom. But in all of these thinkers, God becomes a reflection of something created by us, or some dimension of ourselves. And religion is a reflection of that. And what's interesting about that week is, again, that's an atheism that's very different from new atheism and classical atheism, because they don't engage in arguments against the existence of God. They don't engage with that at all. That's not a question for them. They're not atheist or agnostic in the classical sense. They are what can be called ignostic, I-G, agnostic. And agnosticism means the question is completely irrelevant, right? Because God and religion are reflections of us. So when you study God and when you study religion, you come to an understanding of human society, of ideology, and all of that. And in that week, and this is very key, most of the thinkers, almost all of them, explicitly say that religion is full of hope, is full of longing, is full of reflections on what justice and love and mercy would look like, right? So even Goldman's maybe a slight exception, but even Goldman, like, the idea is that religion is so potentially negative for Goldman precisely because it's so beautiful, right? And Simone de Beauvoir says the same thing. It's like, oh, it's not that religion says terrible things, it's an opiate, right? That's what Marx said. It's a painkiller. It kind of takes all of these things that we long for. We long for justice. We long for mercy. We long for solidarity. We long for connection, right? We long for all these things. And religion packages those. The problem is, as I say, Marx is the clearest on this. It's a type of painkiller. We lose ourselves in the fantasy of in the next life everything will be better, and then we don't fight for that justice here on earth right now because we're kind of lost. And just like I said, for the apophatic tradition, the mystics, this experience of mysticism kind of disconnects you from the material world. Well, that's exactly what these thinkers don't want to do, right? That's exactly what they're going, you go up to the mountaintop, have your DMT experience, but we want to talk about real conflicts, real famines, real injustice that's happening here, and go, how can we make the world a better place? And they each say, and Feuerbach's key on this, they each say that religion paints the picture, and now we have to make that picture a reality in the world. Right? That was Feuerbach's thing, and that's why he said, I'm a friend of the theologians. He says, theology at its best paints a picture of a beautiful world. We just have to take that world and make it a reality here. That's the hard work. That's what we need to do. And that is atheism in a different texture again, because that's not atheism about God doesn't exist, it's logically inconsistent, this or that. No, it's the idea that when we use the word God and when we use the word religion, we're describing something of ourselves. What is that? When we use religion, we are painting a picture of beauty, of longing, of an attempt to overcome alienation, of a place where we will all have food, we will all be cared for, right? And that's beautiful, but it needs to be instantiated. Okay, so that's number 3. So number 4, which was last week, which that's my second favorite talk thing or week is last week. My favorite's probably this week. Then it brought on into the existentialists, and they do something really brilliant, is they say, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. They say, but God, the signifier God, is the name for the ground out of which everything arises. Now, that sounds very woo-woo, but they don't mean it in a woo-woo way. These are existentialists, right? They say that all of our human experience is marked by a sense of something missing. Now, this is why Pascal is considered a proto-existentialist, because his book Pensée, his Notes Pensée, one of the most beautiful pieces of French literature ever written, right? It has probably some of the most powerful reflections on the anguish and the dissatisfaction of being human, right? So Pascal does it. Now that's taken up by psychoanalysis and existentialism. They deepen it, whatever. But Pascal was one of the early writers who wrote beautifully about how to be human is to be dissatisfied. And he wrote about this thing called divertissement, where he said that we find all sorts of ways to avoid this dissatisfaction. Just to give you one example, because I think it's brilliant, is Pascal noticed, and this is pre-Freud, he noticed that there's a double sword, the double-edged sword is life, which is, one is if you don't get what you want, that's really sad and depressing. But if you get what you want, that's also depressing, right? And so Pascal noted very early on that what we do as human beings is we want to find the perfect balance between not getting what we want, but almost getting it, being so close to it. Right? If we're too far from that, we're unhappy, and if we're too close to it, we're unhappy. And I'll give you a few examples. So I'll give you his example, and then I'll give you 2 examples just from the last year in my life. So the example he uses is a gambler. He says, you've got a gambler. Let's imagine that you say to the gambler, listen, you're no longer able to gamble, but here's the money you would have won. Right? Now, the gambler would be happy, they got some money, but they would feel that they've had something very important torn away from them. And if you are a gambler, or if you know people who are gamblers, you know that the gambler loves gambling. It's not just about the money, it's the gambling that's really important. So then Pascal says, oh, okay then, I'm going to let the gambler gamble, but they'll never win. You go, well, the gambler's not going to be happy about that either, right? Because what the gambler wants, and this is what casinos are so brilliant at, is you have to find the right amount of winning and losing that you get to be in that state of perpetual divertissement. And that's what Pascal means by divertisement. Now, two examples, they're both the same example actually, but I saw this, two friends who like sports. I don't like sports, but I watched them. One was in America, this guy was watching American football, and one was a friend who was watching rugby. And in both of these examples, they were rooting for a team. In both examples, their team started to win by loads, really went ahead. And I saw both of them lose interest in the game, started to lose interest. Now, in the rugby game, the losing team started to catch up again in the second half, and I saw my friends start to become interested again, because divertisement, there was getting to a point where there was that edge. I was telling a friend of mine this, and he said that this is so well known in sports. In fact, I think this is the very core of sports. It's so well known in sports that he said that there's something that in American football they do where if you're losing, the next season you get some sort of advantage. Now, if you're watching this, you'll know, I can't remember what it was, but basically it's that if a team's doing really badly, you kind of have to give them a bit of a leg up to keep the interest. Right? By the way, I once met Bill Maher, right? I was at a party in LA, this is a true story, and I was chatting with him, and Sam Harris was there as well. It's a dear friend of mine called Maggie Rue, who knows all of these people, and she's going to be here at Wake, actually. And we're sitting there, and I was talking about this, right? I was chatting away, I was chatting about this, and then I made, it's not a very good joke, right? So don't laugh, but I was making this point to Bill Maher, and he was really not going for it. And I said, well, listen, I'll tell you, this happened to me. I said, when I moved to America, I said, I hate sports. So I thought I should just pick a sport and I should pick a team. Just kind of so as I can chat with people in the pub. And so I said, I chose basketball. And I said, I chose this team, but I said, they never lost. They just won all the time. So it took all the fun out of it. And then I said, they were called, the Harlem Globetrotters. Right? And then Bill Maher looks at me, completely blank. He says, you do know that that's not a real team, don't you? he thought I was being serious. Anyway, that's my Bill Maher story. And then he did that a couple of times in the night. So either my jokes weren't very funny, or he really wasn't picking up on them. Anyway, but the point that I was trying to make was the Harlem Globetrotters. If that was your team, you'd get bored. Now, you wouldn't get bored because of all of the games they play, but if your team always wins, it gets really sad. So Pascal talks about divertisement, and that is what the existentialists talk about. They say, yes, there's this ontological dissatisfaction, and we cover over it in all sorts of ways. And then the existentialists say, all of that is evidence of something missing. And we call what that points to God. So the signifier God doesn't mean something, it points to a ground that can never be known, that cannot be understood, but it's only testified to negatively by this sense of dissatisfaction. So God is a signifier that signifies some ground of being, some singularity. And religious experience is precisely an embrace of that dissatisfaction. Now, that's not what Pascal does. So this is different, right? Pascal, someone like Paul Tillich would say, the desire for ultimate concern, the philosopher's pursuit of truth, the artist's pursuit of beauty, the activist's pursuit of justice, that is the religious experience. And God is the signifier for the ground out of which we all arise. And therefore, religion is designed to keep us sensitive to that longing and not idolatrize it, not make it demonic, which is not think that we have the justice, we have the truth, we know democracy, but somehow keeping this open because we never close it down. We're always yearning for this transformation, never quite grasping it. So that's fourth field of atheism. And that is atheism again, because God does not name something, it kind of names an unnameable ground. That's all we can say about it is, and the proof is not a philosophical, it is a philosophical proof, but it's not it's not like new atheism or the arguments for the existence of God on week one. It's an argument that says in our language, in our mental life and in our bodily life, there is an ongoing sense of something missing. And that sense of something missing is a negative testimony to this ground. And Simone Weil calls that anguish. We're all marked by an anguish, a sense of a loss, a suffering, right? There's real suffering in terms of death and destruction and all of that, but there's also a suffering that is being human, an anguish that is being human. Right? Again, something that's really taken very deeply and seriously by existentialism, psychoanalysis is the two main ones, but others as well. Okay, so that's the fourth field. And now we go on to number 5, and this is the tip of the spear. This is where all the action is today. This is really where it's at. And in this 5th field of atheism, God is a signifier for the lack itself. Not for a hyper being, not for a ground of being, but for a type of fundamental negativity that we cannot grasp. And actually Simone Weil could be equally in this week as in last week, because she kind of bridges the divide. She's a good bridging of these two weeks. So for the people you're going to look at today, and this week, there's Zizek, there's Boothby, there's McGowan, there's Caputo, right? I should say, by the way, a couple of these reflections are over 2 days, so you'll get an email and it will say for this day and the next day, because they're like a 45-minute talk, and I'm just letting you have that over 2 days, because always people will say, some people will see one came in and it doesn't come in the next day, and they'll email me, and that's totally fine, I'll email you back. But if you remember, if you're watching live, some of these, at least 2 of them, are over 2 days. And what each of these thinkers is doing is they are saying that the signifier God is a word we give to a type of negativity that insists in the world. And one way of thinking about this is if the theist says God exists and the atheist says God does not exist, then the radical theologian says God is the name for the inexistent thing. God is the name for a pure negativity that rumbles in the world. And this is deeply important, because you could say that we live in the world of pure positivity. It's the realm of seize the day, be all that you can be, optimize, self-hack, etc., etc. And we see all these modern symptoms that come out of that, ADHD, fatigue, lethargy, and melancholy, all of these depression, these modern symptoms that come out of this protest against this constant drive for pure positivity. When someone like B. Young-Chul Han, really interesting writer, would talk about like almost the virtue of laziness, the virtue of doing nothing, not of doing nothing as in sleeping, but literally the doing of nothing, the kind of like the art of non-productivity. Because even today, a lot of people try to make non-productivity into productivity. So if you take someone like clinical psychologist like Jordan Peterson, he often will talk to his clients who are, say, CEOs, and he'll say, if you want to be more productive, then you should have more sleep. You should take more time with your family. You should go out for walks. So even non-productive activities are done in order to enhance productivity. So like some companies will have like meditation rooms or sleep cells or whatever it is, so that you can, do nothing in a way that makes you more productive, right? The idea of, I remember when I went to LA, in LA you can't even do drugs without it having to have a therapeutic or productive dimension, right? You don't just go and take drugs to get off your face, right? You have to do it in order to meet God, or so that you can write that book or journal better or whatever. So even technically doing something like taking drugs becomes part of this thing of pure positivity. And a lot of the thinkers you're going to look at this week are thinkers who see the importance of negativity, of nothing, and God is the name for that negativity. This is connected primarily to Christian atheism, because for Hegel, who influences a lot of the thinkers you're going to read this week. Christ experiencing self-division, my God, why have you forsaken me, was the mythological or the religious way of describing a type of non-oneness of everything, right? So Hegel's whole argument is what's called dialectics, and it's trying to show that there is a type of lack or crack within everything. It's not that something becomes cracked, it's that reality is cracked from the very beginning. In fact, the crack, in many respects, is what is more fundamental. And what's interesting is Hegel tried to say that this is the fundamental insight. He called it absolute knowing. It was like there's no getting beyond it. Like that's a fundamental insight. And you could say that the history of the last 400 or 500 years has been different disciplines coming to see this at their base. So obviously within biology, we have evolutionary theory. Evolutionary theory is the non-oneness of biological systems with themselves that generates complexity. Within politics, democracy, the non-oneness of the social body that generates civilization. In mathematics, with Gödel's and completeness theorem, that mathematical systems are not at one with themselves. There are things that are true but not provable in sufficiently complex systems. In physics, you have the idea that wave-particle duality. Matter itself is not at one with itself. Right? In psychoanalysis, the unconscious, which is the unconscious not as something, but as the division of consciousness with itself. All of these, and more, that's a few, are where these sciences come to see a type of non-oneness as part of their very being. Hegel would see this as Christ crucified. The experience of Christ crucified is, in religious form, this insight which is discovered for him within philosophy and then within the sciences. And that's why it's Christian. Because in Christianity and all other kind of religious forms, we are alienated from the absolute, either in reality or an illusion we have to see through. For someone like Hegel, what's interesting about Christianity is God is alienated from God. And that's a fundamental insight. And these thinkers you're going to read this week and listen to this week, because there's some things to listen to, are all exploring what does it mean to say that reality is fundamentally divided, and what does it mean to say that the signifier God is the name for that fundamental lack, and that religion arises out of that. Best book I've read in recent years on that subject is Richard Boothby's Embracing the Void. There's a book study on my Patreon, but I just recommend you go and read it. It's a difficult book if you don't know the theory side of it, but it's well worth just working through and persevering. And it really argues that the core of Christianity is love your enemy. And to love your enemy means to be open to their otherness, to that part of them that is different from the same from you, that part of them that is impossible to grasp, to make space for that otherness, to be receptive to that otherness. I think the most brilliant example of this is Tammy Faye Baker in many ways, and a couple of years ago we made a documentary about her. Still hasn't sold yet, but it's a beautiful documentary, 4 parts, and she just could not stop loving, to her detriment, but she could not help being open to the other. When she met people who mocked her, maligned her, disrespected her, she had this openness to them, and she just accepted them, and it was very intoxicating. So that is an openness to this lack in the neighbour, not this lack of abstractly, but this lack in the neighbour, in the other. And that's what you're going to encounter. Now, I will say there's a few different forms of that, and John Caputo is one form that you'll read this week. He's a post-structuralist or a postmodernist, and his view is God is the name for a promise that is still to come. So God is a type of lack, but an openness to the future. Whereas someone like Boothby, Zizek, McGowan, the others you're going to read, they're going to say, well, no, God is not just an openness to the future, kind of the name for a promise. God is a lack that dwells, that is within us. So those are two slightly different things, but they're still in the same field, because they all have this idea of God as the signifier of an openness to a type of radical negativity, a radical lack. And one final thing on that then is, this week is probably where theism and atheism then become indistinguishable, right? Each week, so it's like once you got past the little half week, right? Your classical atheism, you go, okay, that's philosophical atheism, new atheism. Then the second week, that's theological atheism. Then there's the materialist atheism of the next week, and then there's the theological atheism of the existentialists. And each move, theism and atheism become slightly more blurred. This week it becomes very blurred, because God is the name for that which does not exist. So now theism and atheism are kind of one and the same thing in a deeper way than previous weeks. Now, this is complicated, I understand, and if this is your first time listening to this stuff, you might be completely lost. Don't worry, it's like a 3D picture. You don't see it, you don't see it, you don't see it. And then eventually you skew your eyes just the right way, and suddenly the picture appears. For those of you who have been following this work and engaging with me for many years, this will hopefully be more understandable. It'll also be more understandable once you start looking at these thinkers. And this week is an invitation to really see what you like and see what you don't like, and go deeper into those things. Because this week is kind of, as I say, it's the tip of the spear. There's not much more places you can go. Obviously we haven't covered everything, but these 5 fields of atheism, if you get that, if you're able to name and understand those, you've kind of got a very broad understanding. And then, as I say, the last week, we will do parotheology, and I'll try to see how this journey relates to what we're trying to create in this communion that is Transformance Art and my Patreon. Okay, so little question from Ulrich. Hopefully I'm always saying that right. I always feel like I'm not saying it quite right anyway. I noticed Marx, etc., criticize religion as an individual internalized thing. What would Marx and co. think about the religion of the Franciscan monks who live in poverty and give all to the poor? What would Marx think? So Marx's main criticism, early Marx, his main criticism in the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, which is what you had in the Atheism for Lent, his critique is that religion, he says, is the cry of an oppressed people. What is it? The soul of a soulless condition, the heart of a heartless nation, right? He has this beautiful way of describing it. Because religion paints such a beautiful picture. But it's precisely because of that he says, as we've talked about, it's a painkiller. We get lost in that fantasy, and we don't fight for justice here and now. So Marx wouldn't have any problems with thinking, well, some people are so in love with that painting that they go off and sit in monasteries. And he also wouldn't be surprised that some people do, like liberation theology, take that vision and try to make the world a better place. But he would be saying that doesn't happen very often. He would probably say the Franciscans, that's less of a thing, because he's got, like, they're just so in love with the vision. Yeah, they're so in love with the vision that, almost like the apophatic, and the Franciscans are obviously very close to that. St. Francis of Assisi had a mystical experience. So the Franciscans are like Pascal. They're like, yeah, status and possessions mean nothing, right? Who cares, right? So they're in love. They're in love with that vision, that beatitudinal vision of the heaven. They sit in their monasteries. I think, Marx would go like, yep, I understand that. For other people, religion is the very thing that allows them to work terrible jobs because they go, it'll be better in the next life. The thing that's even more interesting says liberation theology, where some people do take that vision and try to make it real on earth. What Marx would probably say is, well, yeah, they're pretty much doing what Feuerbach said. They're pretty much taking that vision and they're trying to embrace it on earth. But he would probably think that that is a small movement that probably generally leads to what could be called embodied atheism, where somebody might believe in their head, but actually they're basically atheistic in their activities. They're giving themselves to real justice in the world. But it was then people like Bonhoeffer, etc., who tried to then, as I say, bring that into a different vision, a different theological vision. That's just some thoughts. How you need to be drunk to pronounce it correctly. Okay, well, we'll do that at wake. Although, mind you, I don't drink anymore, so yeah, I'll watch you drink. Okay, listen, everybody, thank you so much. If you've made it this far, congratulations, well done. You're in the home straight. You also have all the material for life, so you can go back and pick away at it. But remember the 5 fields. Test yourself. Try to think, can I name the 5 to some degree? Can I see how each of them kind of take up the previous one? And say that number 5 is this week. So try and do it with the 4 that you know. And this week is number 5, maybe the most difficult of all, but also the most